Good evening, everyone. May I remind you to put your mobiles on silent, please, if you have them on. Welcome to our first talk on key contemporary thinkers, Deleuze, Latour, and Harman, by Professor Arjen Kleinherenbrink from Radboud University. Professor Kleinherenbrink is a specialist in metaphysics and philosophical anthropology. His most recent publications are a book called Against Continuity, Gilles Deleuze's Speculative Realism, and another book published in Dutch on Bruno Latour. Today's talk is entitled Gilles Deleuze and the Metaphysics of Machines, and it's part of a four-series talk on, as I said, key contemporary thinkers. The other three talks are on the 17th, the 19th, and the 24th of October. You can find all the other information, all the relevant information on Facebook, as well as the university website. I guess it's over to you.
Thank you very much. And let me start by thanking you all for being here this evening and taking the time, and also by thanking Claude and Nikki and the philosophy department for kindly inviting me to Malta and for the opportunity to do these lectures. So as Nikki already said, this will be the first of 4 lectures that revolve around a common theme, and that common theme is a metaphysical idea about what reality is ultimately like. So each of the philosophers that are addressed in these lectures, in their own way, holds that reality consists of irreducible individual entities. And the idea of these lectures is basically to give an overview, to present why that is an interesting idea, reality consisting of irreducible entities. So these philosophers oppose any system of thought according to which the vast diversity of our world, of our reality, would be reducible to mere representations of a handful of overarching things or laws or structures or forces. And with that term, mere representation, I mean something that would not add its own difference to the world, something that would not be causally efficacious in its own right. So a mere representation would just be a sign of something else, of something more fundamental that is doing all the real work. And irreducibility, as I will discuss it in these lectures, is opposed to that idea. So to defend irreducibility, or what we could also call pluralism, is, for example, to hold that reality is not reducible to interactions between subatomic particles or fields. It is to hold that nothing in our world is reducible to the experience of subjects that perceive it. It is to hold that ecosystems comprising our planet are not mere expressions of some overarching force that we could call nature with a capital N. And it is to hold that our artifacts are not under the sway of any form of technological determinism, or likewise that our institutions and enterprises are no mere puppets on the strings of a market with a capital M. And finally, it is to hold that you, along with every other human being on the planet, are never reducible to your biology, your history, or your language, even though these things inform your every move and may overpower you from time to time. So in other words, the theories addressed in these lectures defend that reality is produced by an immense diversity of entities among themselves, though existing at different scales, and each of them equipped with its own degree of agency. And that idea may sound incredibly boring or even unphilosophical to some, because for philosophers, there is always something rather appealing and exciting to this idea of precisely rejecting the diversity of the world in favor of some grand, overarching force or principle that operates behind the scenes, some half-hidden structure or principle that allows you and your companions to see what everyone else is blind to namely that the world around us is just a representation of some privileged structure or ultimate agency. But even though the philosophers introduced in these lectures emphatically reject such an ultimately paranoid worldview, their own positions are far from boring or quotidian. Having said that, as an introduction, I think it's time to talk about tonight's actual subject, which is, as Nikki also introduced, the philosophy of the French thinker Gilles Deleuze, more specifically his Metaphysics. So, after his death in 1995, Deleuze has, without any doubt, become one of the most well-known continental thinkers, with a strong influence not just in philosophy, but also in the arts, architecture, culture studies, and many other fields besides. And Deleuze's work broadly falls into two categories. There are his solo works, including his famous Différences et Répétitions and his undeservedly less famous Logique du Sens. And then there are his later collaborations with the French psychoanalyst, philosopher, and activist Félix Guattari, including the infamous books L'Anti-Oedipe and Mille Plateaux. And if you ask philosophers, then quite often they will say that Deleuze's main contribution to philosophy is the metaphysics developed in Difference and Repetition. I'll use the English book titles from now on. In Difference and Repetition, we find the so-called metaphysics of difference, unsurprisingly given the book's title. A metaphysics that divides reality into two distinct realms, or dimensions, as Deleuze calls them. One realm of actual things, and one realm of virtual things. And I will explain what those two terms mean in a moment. But in their admiration for this justly famous metaphysics of virtuality and actuality, philosophers often overlook that Deleuze moved away from this early philosophy soon after writing Difference and Repetition. And we know that simply because Deleuze explicitly says so in a preface to his next book, Logique du Sens, The Logic of Sense. From that book onward, Deleuze developed a second metaphysics, the metaphysics of machines, that matures in his collaborations with Guattari. So my aim, the idea for this evening, is to recount how Deleuze sought a philosophical theory to account for irreducibility, the irreducibility of individual entities, how his first metaphysics more or less failed in that regard, despite its promise, and how his second and often overlooked metaphysics might just have succeeded, or at least do a better job. So the story begins then with the question of why Deleuze would care about irreducibility in the first place. Why is that something that you would be interested in philosophically? And if we use Deleuze's own terminology, it is because relations must be external to terms. That's a bit technical, so I'll explain. The idea of externality, relations must be external to terms, animates all of Deleuze's writings, from his early monographs on Hume, Spinoza, and Nietzsche, right up to his later essays about philosophy, literature, and cinema, the ones that he wrote towards the end of his life. So relations are external to terms. What does that mean? A term, in that kind of formula, a term can be any entity in any kind of domain, anything you like, including persons, riots, planets, thoughts, horses, subatomic particles, and hammers. So it's a maximally inclusive concept. And any kind of property of a term, so of a riot, of a horse, and so on, that concerns either its parts or its functioning as a part of some larger entity, is what you can call a relational property. So if you yourself are a term, then your weight and your length are relational properties, because these concern your biological parts, right? Your body has a certain length, has a certain weight. Similarly, your job and your nationality are also relational terms, relational properties of you, because they refer to larger entities in which you function. So if I'm talking about relationism or relations in tonight's context, I'm talking about an entity's relations either with the parts that compose it or with the environment in which it functions. So to hold, according to Deleuze, that relations are external to their terms means that entities must, metaphysically speaking, be more than the sum of their relational properties. It means that entities must have a private internal reality that is irreducible to its relations with other entities, and therefore also irreducible to other entities. So, as an example, it means that if we take all of your parts, so let's say all of your biological bits, plus all of your thoughts, and all of your memories, the sum total of everything about which you could say, those are the parts that make me me. And if we add to that all of the ways in which you function in an environment, so everything you do in your life, so the family of which you are a part, the religion that you may profess, the language that you may speak, and we take the sum of those two things, the sum of all your relational parts and all of your relations with your environment, then externalism says that that sum does not give us all the facts about you. So externality means that a person, an event, or a thing is always more than the sum of its parts plus the role it plays in its environment. And incidentally, as a small aside, it's easy to see here how metaphysics quickly starts to bear on politics and ethics. After all, people are quite often asked to conflate their very identity, that which they are, with a nation, a religion, a language, a culture, or a history, so how they function in an environment, or even with their biological constitution, with their parts, as when they are told that they are nothing but their evolutionary drives or neurological parts. In such cases, your very being is made internal to your relations with some other entity, and as such, you are reduced. Right? So within the parameters of tonight's talk, an internalist position would be to say something like everything you do is reducible to how capitalist ideology has you by the balls, plus how your evolutionary drives and genes are, giving you certain desires and urges. Right? It explains everything you do away in terms of larger overarching forces or deeply ingrained parts of you. That's an internalist position. An externalist position is to say, no, those kinds of things may be very powerful, they may be among the things that make you who you are, but there is always something more to say about you. You are metaphysically always something of a surplus in addition to that. And that is not just true for you, but also for your bottle of water, for the car or the bike that you took to get here, and so on. So that's a nice thought, but what are the arguments for it, for that idea of externality? Why this metaphysical wiggle room between your parts and your actions in an environment? Well, Deleuze gives us two groups of reasons why we should agree with this externality thesis. And the first group is drawn from everyday experiences that we should all be able to confirm. The first reason concerns perception, what we see happening in the world around us. As Deleuze writes, very simply, we constantly see that entities can sever their current relations and traverse various contexts while nevertheless remaining the same entities. A university can hire new staff, change its curriculum, and relocate to other buildings while still remaining that university. Just like a piece of wood can be incorporated into various structures over the course of its existence while still remaining that piece of wood. So experience confirms that there is wiggle room between a thing's relations and actions on the one hand and its identity on the other hand. The second reason drawn from experience concerns learning. Deleuze notes that when we learn something, for example, when we learn to swim or to speak a certain language, we never quite exhaust the objects that we learn about. No matter how good you can swim or how well you speak a language, you never know everything there is to learn about that language, and you are never the perfect swimmer who is in full control of the water in which you immerse yourself. So in learning to get to know something, we realize that indefinitely many relations with the object that we are trying to learn something about are possible, and that none of those relations ever directly reveal the very essence or being of that object. We only ever register profiles or surfaces or signs of objects whose ultimate being always eludes us. And the third argument for experience for Deleuze concerns novelty. Very early in his career, in a seminar called Qu'est-ce que fondé? What is grounding? Deleuze already notes that newly produced entities always contain what he calls unexpected surprises, which is a nice way of putting that entities always have emergent properties that are irreducible and hence external to other entities by virtue of which they exist. Water, for example, simply has emergent properties that oxygen and hydrogen do not have, just like you have emergent properties that your internal organs do not have, right? You speak a language, your liver, your heart, and so on do not speak a language. But of course, arguments from experience are not decisive in metaphysics, which is why Deleuze also gives us a series of more ontological, conceptual arguments. And in the interest of time, I'm only going to repeat two of them here. First, if relations are internal to terms, so if you are nothing but your relations with your parts and your environment, and that's also true for everything else, and if that would be true across the board universally, then Deleuze says, or Deleuze notes, the current state of affairs could not pass, which means change would be impossible. If every single thing is nothing except for its current relational ties to other things, change cannot happen. Given that change exists, nevertheless, there must be something more to entities than their current relational engagements. Right? So imagine that, to give it a visual metaphor, imagine that this is you, and then all of your relations with other things extend into lines that together form kind of a spider's web, right? If that is true for everything, if everything is solidly stuck in its current relations, then of course nothing can move from that spider's web. You are like the fly trapped in that web. Or, to use the term that Deleuze sometimes gives, ours would be a frozen universe, a frozen reality without any kind of becoming. Right? In other words, I am currently engaged in a number of relations, right? There are clothes sticking to my body, I'm being watched by a certain amount of people, my internal organs are doing all kinds of things, but those themselves do not give me a principle by which I could change. So according to Deleuze, I must be something more in addition to that actuality in order to shift from one situation to another. And then I hope that the rest of the lecture slowly flashes out that idea and that objection a bit more. But that's the first metaphysical argument against internalism. Second argument, a popular version of internalism, reductionism, is the idea that everything is ultimately reducible to a single material substratum. And this substratum would then have an internal relation with all entities and all relations between those entities. Everything would ultimately just be a certain kind of fundamental stuff, fundamental physical material, so that everything we see around us would just be a representation of those more basic material substances or processes that are actually doing all the work behind the scenes, as it were. Deleuze rejects this, and he mobilizes classical objections to substance dualism. To do so, it would be, for example, unclear why this single material substrate ever fractured, so to say, into a wide variety of things, or at least this appearance of the existence of a wide variety of things, right? It's a classical objection to, for example, pre-Socratic positions, which tell you, well, everything is water or everything is fire. Well, if everything is fire, then how come that fire manifests as a chair over here and as a Dutch philosopher over here and as a water bottle over there, and so on? Second, no, that was already the argument. Why would it manifest as this over here rather than that over here? Deleuze pejoratively calls such materialism a form of bare repetition, by which he means to emphasize that it cannot possibly account for the fullness of reality. So relations then, on Deleuze's count, are external to terms, meaning that entities are irreducible to their parts and environments, and that gives us kind of a metaphysical puzzle. Because if that is the case, and you don't need to agree, you just need to see why Deleuze, based on these arguments, would maneuver into that direction. If that is the case, if you are more than your relations, there must be some private aspect to you and to every other kind of entity that can never be dissolved into or reduced to your engagements with your parts or environments. And the puzzle that we now have before us is, what is that thing or that stuff or that aspect of things, right? So it's kind of a philosophical detective novel, as Deleuze also calls his own Difference and Repetition in the preface. So, difference and repetition. And of course, it's impossible to present the full metaphysical glory of that book in a single lecture, so I'll keep myself limited to the basic ideas, but those are easily enough understood, I think. And what also helps is that Deleuze was at some point asked to summarize that kind of doorstop and kind of present the main points of his theory in a presentation that has been published under the title of The Method of Dramatization. So I'll also draw from that. There he tells us that each thing or each entity must be understood as having two ontological, metaphysical halves that in turn each have two aspects. So Deleuze understands entities as fourfolds, which is also true for Graham Harman, whose ontology we will discuss in the third lecture. Right? So when we're calling something a fourfold in metaphysics, it means that it has four aspects that you always find in conjunction with each other. So you're never going to find an entity that only has two or three of these aspects. By analogy, you may recall the Platonic theory where Plato tells us that the soul has three parts, right? Logos for reason, thumos for temper or drive, and eros for desire. But it's never going to be the case that you will find a soul that is just characterized by logos and thumos and not by eros, right? Every soul is going to carry those three aspects in it. So the soul is a threefold. Likewise, if we're moving back to metaphysics, if metaphysicians say that entities are fourfolds, we're saying that anything that you're going to find, whether it's a chair or a horse and so on, is going to have those four aspects, no exceptions. So, two levels, actuality and virtuality, and each is going to have two aspects. That gives us kind of the formal coordinates for this metaphysical puzzle. First, there is, let's say, the upper half that Deleuze calls the actual half of things. Things are actual insofar as they have qualities, that's that first aspect that we're looking for, and second, insofar as they have parts, or are parts of something else. So actual things have parts that constitute them, and in turn are parts of larger things themselves. And all of those parts have qualities. So you, for example, are an actual thing with actual qualified parts. For example, you have a strong heart, a weak stomach, or low blood sugar. And in turn, you are again a qualified part of larger, let's put it like that, actual entities. For example, you can be a fanatical supporter of a soccer team or a diligent worker at a law firm or diligent student at a university, right? So when we're talking about actuality, Deleuze is talking about the world of relational things, right? You have parts with certain qualities that help make you what you are, and you are in turn a qualified part of larger structures by which you help them be what they are. But since Deleuze believes, as we have established, that relations are not internal to terms, that these relational actual aspects of entities are not all there is to be said about them, we must have some other aspect as well. And that second aspect is Deleuze's famous virtual, the virtual half of things. And virtuality, where actuality consists of basically stuff as we find it in the world plus its qualities, virtuality, that non-relational half of things, consists of what Deleuze calls singularities and differential relations. And those terms are words that you do not hear every day unless you are a mathematician, so they require some explanation. I'll first tell you what singularities and differential relations are, and then discuss how they fit Deleuze's overall objective of accounting for externality. Right? So starting with singularities, abstracting a bit in order to get our conceptual bearings. Singularities come in two kinds, two sorts of points. On the one hand, remarkable points. On the other hand, ordinary points. An ordinary point is simply a point where something happens, but it's not really special. A remarkable point is a point where something special happens, namely it's a point where a qualitative difference occurs. Sounds very abstract, but there are easy examples. For example, 0 and 100 degrees Celsius are remarkable points for water, remarkable singularities. Why? Because at those points, water undergoes a qualitative change, right? When a volume of water that is cooling down passes through, so to say, the point of 0 degrees, it changes from a liquid into a solid. And a volume of water that is heating up changes from a solid into a gas at 100 degrees. So those are remarkable singularities. An example of an ordinary singularity, an ordinary point, would be the point where water passes 20 degrees, when it's either heating up or cooling down. Something happens there, it's getting warmer or getting colder, but there is no qualitative change, right? Water that passes through this point of 20 degrees, when it's heating up until 21 degrees, so it remains a liquid. So that's singularities, points around which stuff happens. A differential relation, right, that was the second ingredient of this mysterious virtual that we're trying to get in view. A differential relation, Deleuze tells us, is a very specific kind of relation, namely a relation between, and I'll quote, elements stripped of all sensible form and function, existing only through their reciprocal determination. So let's do that again. Elements stripped of all sensible form and function, existing only through their reciprocal determination. End of quote. So a differential relation is a relation between elements, we don't know what those are yet, we'll get there, that do not have any properties in and of themselves. Right? In and of themselves, they are completely undetermined, but they are nevertheless reciprocally determinable by each other. So we have these three, cannot do it with this hand, three mysterious ingredients. Singularities, points where something happens. Differential relations between elements that do not have any properties in and of themselves. And we have these mysterious elements that are now added to the mix. But rest assured, that's the basic metaphysical furniture that we need to understand Deleuze's virtual. So no more conceptual engineering beyond this. Now we just need to figure out how these things click. So let's try to do that. In the actual world, which for all intents and purposes you can simply equate with the world as you encounter it on a daily basis, with all kinds of events and individual things in it, and you are also one of those individuals. In that getting ahead of myself. In that actual world, relations between things, or relations between you and others, are never reciprocal. They are unilateral. That means that they only go from one point to another point, and they don't go back. Simply put, if you are a part of a university, as a student or as a member of staff, then this does not imply that the university is also a part of you. If you are struck by the beauty of a river, then this does not imply reciprocity. It does not imply that the river is also smitten with admiration for you. Right? So in a very concrete example, the mistake that stalkers make when they're chasing their celebrity targets is to think that love or desire is reciprocal, is to think that I relate to that celebrity in a certain way. I love them, therefore, by necessity, they must also love me. No, relations are unilateral. The fact that you love them does not imply that they love you as well. So in the actual world, relations are one-way traffic. If you are in love with your partner and they are in love with you, then this is not one relation characterized by reciprocity. Instead, there are two relations intertwined. One relation that you have with them and one relation that they have with you. That's why love is so incredibly difficult, because you're always kind of communicating across different channels. Two people are nodding and everybody else is going, nope, never. My love is reciprocal. Well, you know. Well, back to the virtual, which Deleuze tells us is different in kind from the actual. How? Because in the virtual, Deleuze holds, at a virtual level, relations are reciprocal. And this has tremendous consequences. It's the solution to the puzzle, Deleuze thinks, because if relations are reciprocal, reducibility becomes impossible. Why is that the case? Well, here we go. If you have two elements, A and B, you can imagine any kind of entity that you want, but you have to subtract all of its properties. Because Deleuze tells us, virtually speaking, nothing has properties in and of itself. So let's say we have two elements, A and B, and they are completely undetermined in and of themselves. But then they start to relate. And this relation is completely reciprocal. I would need a third hand for this. So here's B, right? A, B, reciprocal relation. What does that mean? It means that A starts to determine the very nature of B. But that changes B, which means that B starts to determine A. But that changes A. So now A starts to change B in a different way than the first time I passed this point, which changes B. Which makes B change A in a different way than it did before. Is everybody on board with this kind of metaphysical engine? Because everything I've been working up to kind of hinges on this. Good. There are enough nods for me to continue. Now, why does that prevent reducibility? Because none of these poles is static. None of them can ever become the master term to which the other is reduced, because they change each other in an indefinitely long process, right? So instead of a static relation in which one determined element, in which one already determined element, the nation, the system, and so on, determines the being of some other element, us poor schmucks, a differential relation is a genetic and dynamic relation between elements that keep determining each other, but by virtue of doing that, change how they are determining each other. That's a differential relation. So these elements are not static things, they are indeterminate processes, right? And because of their ongoing reciprocal determinations, these elements constantly differ not just from each other, but also from themselves, right? But with each passage, with each round, so to say, your very nature changes if you're such an element. Hence, such an element can be called a différence en soi, a difference in itself. And that's the virtual, and that's probably the most abstract piece of metaphysics I'm going to discuss in all 4 lectures, so if you're still somewhat on board at this point, we should be fine. If you're already completely lost, then everything is fine as well, because remember that this is the metaphysics that Deleuze is going to ditch in favor of something better. But for now, we have this virtual half of reality. It consists of pure processes that don't have properties in and of themselves, but kind of give each other properties through these reciprocal relations. And for our purposes here, the remarkable singularities that I mentioned earlier are best defined, are best understood as the point where these pure processes are mutually determining each other with sufficient intensity to make something actual emerge in our world, like a volcanic eruption. And that's the metaphysics of difference and repetition in a nutshell. We have a world of actual things that exist in relations to each other, so this theater as we see it, but their being is not exhausted in those relations. It is external to those relations. The reason is that each actual entity has this virtual underground half, and this virtual half of pure elements consists of processes that determine each other reciprocally in that weird kind of engine. And this virtual half, Deleuze believes, at this point, prevents entities from being reducible to each other, from being dissolved into each other, up to the point where everything would be stuck in its relations and nothing could change. Precisely, again, because reciprocal determinations ought to keep the virtual aspects of entities constantly differing from themselves and others. If you find this an unintuitive way of thinking, after studying Deleuze for 10 years, I find it an intuitive way of thinking, but I remember what it's like. If you find it an unintuitive way of thinking, compare it to the kind of naturalist metaphysics that is very popular these days, that holds that the world as we know it, as we perceive it, is a mere representation of a deeper layer of reality where all the causal work is really being done by subatomic particles, fields, snares, or processes, right? In that naturalist metaphysics, it would be wrong to say that I am currently causing this pen to move, right? Because ultimately, and properly speaking, metaphysically speaking, there would be no pen, there would be no Dutch philosopher, there would just be a bunch of subatomic entities, either particles, fields, or processes, that would change position or something like that, right? So if you would be able to take a God's eye view of reality, from which you would see reality as it really is, you would not see a human being and a pen. You would just see these subatomic entities doing whatever it is that they do. Deleuze is saying something similar in difference and repetition with this theory of the actual world as we see it and the virtual world that produces that actual world. The only difference is that his ultimate ground for reality is not found in some final physical layer that the natural sciences might someday uncover. His ground for reality is transcendental rather than material in nature. And transcendental here means simply that it's something that never manifests empirically. As such, transcendental aspects of reality are not available manifestly in space or time and can only be understood by the exercise of reason, not by the exercise of our senses, no matter how much sophisticated equipment we might use to enhance those senses. Finally, we must add that Deleuze conceives of this virtual dimension as a single and continuous realm. It is a realm of undetermined elements that are all connected to each other via these differential relations without any sharp boundaries between concrete individuals. Because the world of concrete individuals is the actual world in which we live. That's precisely the thing that this virtual needs to produce. So the virtual is, as Deleuze often calls it, a pre-individual field full of dynamism, from which the static individuals that comprise actuality must emerge. All right. Now, what's wrong with this picture? First of all, it renders, so we're slowly going to shift into part 2. First of all, it renders actual reality entirely inoperative. As the British philosopher Peter Holworth has, in my view, decisively shown in his wonderful book, Out of This World, that's really worth reading, Deleuze's virtual realm does all the causal work in reality, not just the heavy lifting, all the lifting. This is because Deleuze understands actual relations, right? You sitting on the chair that you sit on, you and your heart rate and so on, are understood as being completely static. Hence, they cannot be the causes of changes. So if anything is to change, so if a volcano is to erupt, or if you are to declare your love for someone, it requires a virtual event to take place and then actualize. The price to pay, there's always a price to pay for every metaphysical system, the price to pay for this metaphysics of the virtual is that our entire actual world is just as causally inactive as the events in an animated movie. Sure, you might think that the villain pointing a gun at the protagonist causes the protagonist to raise their hands in the next shot. But in reality, these are just successive images with no causal connection between those images themselves. The causal factor is, of course, the projector that is making these images run, and the projector itself never appears in the movie itself, unless it's a weird Scandinavian art house movie and so on, but that's not what I'm talking about. Same thing for the virtual. The virtual produces everything that is available to us empirically, but it never manifests empirically, even though we can figure out what it must be like with our powers of reason. But that view of reality as we know it being entirely unoperative, entirely static, entirely passive, is implausible, but it's not impossible. There is no logical reason why that could not be the case. So there are other problems that are more damning. The real problems with the metaphysics of the virtual are a bit more basic. If the elements or processes or differences or whatever you want to call them that constitute this virtual dimension of reality are completely undetermined, they are nothing in and of themselves, well, then we can ask, how on earth did one or several of them ever acquire properties by virtue of which they would be distinct from other such elements? Logically speaking, why would a realm of fully undetermined elements that have no properties to set them apart from each other not just be a single homogeneous and unchanging mass, one big gray lump? Except it would not be gray and it would not be lump because it would not have properties, right? After all, if element A and B are truly completely undetermined in and of themselves, then they must be identical to each other because they have no properties to render them distinct. Leibniz already saw this. This problem remains unaccounted for in the metaphysics of the virtual. Second problem, if there is an entire realm of naturally undetermined elements that are active among themselves, then why on earth did those entities ever even start to produce actual reality? Why is everything there is not simply virtual? This too remains largely unexplained. That's a classical problem. It's also something that you can put to a pre-Socratic thinker. Like, if everything is ultimately water or fire, then why did it do X something to at least appear to itself as if it's a bunch of stuff that is not water or fire? Thirdly, a differential relation, so the kind of relation that makes for this engine between these elements, is still a relation, even if it is reciprocal rather than unilateral. Therefore, the whole problem of internality, this is a bit technical, but it's still something worth mentioning. The whole problem of internality seems to repeat itself at the virtual level. Namely, if undetermined element A, no, for the viewers at home, if undetermined element A is to alter undetermined element B, such that B's relation to A also alters, and so on, then this entire engine, so to speak, only works if A and B have properties that are separate from those reciprocal relations to each other, because otherwise those entities would devour each other. They would dissolve into each other, just in a more dynamic and Ouroboros-like fashion than how reduction would work on the level of actuality. Fourth, and finally, we can ask, where do the unformed elements of the virtual come from? They are not produced by actual entities because the actual world has no bearing on the virtual, so these virtual elements seem to be rather ad hoc posits whose existence is asserted rather than explained. And Deleuze seems to have realized these kinds of problems as early as in The Logic of Sense, his next book. And that brings us to his second Metaphysics. But do not worry, everything we have covered so far is not entirely going out of the window. Many elements are retained. In his collaborations with Guattari, for example, Deleuze still firmly adheres to that principle of externality. Relations must be external to terms. Things must be more than their relations with their parts and environments. So, for example, on the first page, the very first page of Mu Plateau, their big book, they write that one must not overlook the exteriority of things to their relations, and they give the example that a book must never be reduced to either the intentions of its author or the interpretations of its readers, right? A book is always more. It's something that exists in between those two levels. But in these later works with Guattari, there is no longer, for Deleuze, there's no longer a virtual realm underlying all things and doing all the causal work. The virtual dimension is no longer there as the basic ground of reality. According to their new metaphysics, the basic and minimum unit of reality is instead the assemblage, agencement in French. The assemblage or the machine, just machine in French. Again, a machine can be anything, any term. So a desk, a person, an army, a river, a theory, a thought, an emotion, and so on. And every machine in this new metaphysics is still a fourfold entity, except that Deleuze and Guattari now call it tetravalent, which just means the same. And because it is a fourfold, every machine remains external and hence irreducible to other machines. So let's see how that works. First, it might seem strange to use the term machine as a metaphysical concept. With that word, though, Deleuze wants to express that entities produce, alter, and maintain and destroy each other among themselves. The term machine stresses that the things of this world are all fully causally active and that they need no further metaphysical substrate or overarching structure in order for them to be what they are. Hence Deleuze's famous term in those later works, the plane of immanence, which simply expresses that there is no transcendent entity hovering above or below machines to lord over their existence from afar. A machine, then, is something that is not a mere representation, but rather something that works and operates and makes its own difference in our reality. Insofar as machines enter into relations with each other, they are what Anti-Oedipus calls partial objects, each with their own qualities. So that's already, again, two of those four aspects, ontological aspects of a machine. Together, they again comprise the actual side of a machine, the one that you might encounter in space and time. So when you see a building, you do not perceive its very being or ontological essence. Instead, what you perceive is a partial object, right? The building from a certain angle, with a certain kind of light falling onto it, and so on. You see it in terms of features that you are capable of registering from your specific perspective. This actual side of machines is again a twofold, because that same partial object, the building from the angle that you perceive it, because that same building can endure a shifting flow of qualities. As for example, it changes color because a cloud moves in front of the sun and so on. So that's the actual side of a machine. Nothing new under the sun here. That's more or less the same as we have discussed actuality, indifference, and repetition. But in addition to that, every machine is now granted a private interior that is not reducible to its relations. In his book, Proust and Science, Deleuze therefore calls this interior a non-communicating vessel. In the logic of sense, he calls it a body that always remains enveloped, so that other bodies never have direct access to it. And in his collaborations with Guattari, this is famously called le corps sans organes, the body without organs, which simply means that we should not understand the body of a machine in terms of a certain kind of unity amongst its parts, but rather as a transcendental unifying principle that is irreducible to and different in kind from those parts. So simply speaking, if Deleuze is talking about the body, he's not talking about my fleshy bits, he's talking about some kind of metaphysical unifying principle that makes me me. Okay, that's not really simply speaking, but at this point in the lecture, I think we can understand what that means. So the body of a machine, Deleuze and Guattari add, is characterized by what they sometimes call, confusingly call, desire. And at other times, more adequately call its puissance in French, its powers to act and be acted upon. So this twofold, no longer a virtual realm, this twofold of a body with certain powers replaces the notion of the virtual dimension that would underlie all things. Instead of this single unified realm, we now have a completely private virtual aspect, a combination of a body and its powers, completely unique to each entity, that other entities never access directly. This is because entities only ever encounter each other as partial objects, which means as manifestations of their powers. And manifestations are expressions of powers, but they do not resemble those powers and are not reducible to them. I'll get to some concrete examples soon. So the resulting metaphysics upholds an internal difference between what an entity, a machine, internally is and what it does externally, how it manifests externally in relations with others. For example, every single one of you has many powers, many things that you are capable of doing, and many things that determine what can be done to you. Your powers are the ground for everything that you do in reality. In addition, they are also the ground for how you register certain qualities in reality, right? If you are colorblind, you do not have the power to discern color and so on. Quite simply, you can only experience other objects in terms of the capacities, the powers that you have, or rather are. And these powers are somewhat akin to classical essences, but not entirely, right? A classical essence is something that never changes, no matter what would happen to you. On the classical Aristotelian view, for example, no human being can ever fail to essentially be a rational animal, no matter how dumb you act. By contrast, powers make for a completely different kind of essence. Powers are generated, regenerated, and possibly destroyed by virtue of your connections to other entities. You only have the power to speak your mother tongue, for example, because of countless connections that you have had and keep having throughout your existence with other speakers of that language, with school books, with movies and songs in that language, and so on. And that power is only reproduced on a daily basis insofar as you are connected to all kinds of relevant biological parts, insofar as you have thoughts and memories that you process in that language, and all kinds of other machines, as Deleuze and Guattari, that keep you connected to that power in relevant ways. So here again, we see why they opt for this kind of terminology, right? Because in this second metaphysics, any power that you have, whether it's the power to walk, or the power to speak a certain language, or the power to play soccer really well. I don't know what all the things are that you can do. You always need this enormous kind of factory, right? This enormous network of ongoing connections that constantly reproduce what you are and what you can do. Nevertheless, a power is not reducible to what generates it or to what it generates. Your power to speak your mother tongue is not a bunch of tiny textbooks and conversations somehow directly beamed into your mind. No, those textbooks and conversations have generated something entirely new in the world, namely your power to speak such and such language. Likewise, no single sentence or even set of sentences is ever your fully manifest power to speak a certain language. The sentences that you speak, the sentences that I speak in English express that power, but they are not identical to it, let alone reducible to it. So again, the resulting view of reality is this gigantic network, this factory-like thing in which every entity is produced and reproduced by other entities that it encounters. I encounter you in actual terms, that upper half of every machine, right? I encounter you as having certain parts, your limbs and so on, and as being a part of something else, in this case as being part of an audience, right? But what that causes in me are shifts in my powers, right? Depending on the audience response, tonight I might walk away being either more confident or much more anxious about speaking in public. Okay. There we go. But that in and of itself is not a manifest property, right? It may manifest during the next lecture. Maybe I will drop my pen more often, or my voice will quaver, or my hands will shake. But then, of course, that shaking of the hands or dropping of the pen is not my anxiety itself. It's an expression of how my powers have changed, my dispositions, my capacity in this reality. Right. So entities acquire powers through encounters with other things. Hence, machines are constituted in what Deleuze and Guattari call rhizomatic fashion, with rhizome referring to how certain weeds and crops do not grow from a central stem or branch, but rather proliferate and grow in various ways and all kinds of directions. A human being, for example, does not just acquire their powers from a single source, language or history or culture or family or ideology or DNA or the workings of your brain. You acquire your powers from all of those things in conjunction, but in various combinations and to different degrees in different cases. Hence, another synonym Deleuze and Guattari often use for that term machine is multiplicité, multiplicity, with pli referring to a fold in French. Every entity essentially is the powers, capacities, the puissance that its engagements with the world fold into it, and every manifestation, everything something does, is an unfolding of those powers into an actual expression. And one important consequence of this second metaphysics of machines, or at least one aspect of it that I find really fascinating, is that it emphasizes how much of our reality should actually be understood in terms of tensions, in terms of fragile productive relations. The problems with, usually a metaphysical theory gives you this nice overarching structure or foundational baseline that all of reality relies on. But this metaphysics of machines is a metaphysics in a sense of fragility, right? It's a philosophy of maintenance. Because the problem with machines, or the wonderful thing about machines, depending on how you look at it, is that no machine is ever automatically or naturally endowed with certain properties, that no machine is ever automatically or naturally in possession of its parts or a member of something bigger as a part itself. Right? Because a machine always needs neighboring entities to keep hold of its parts, to keep functioning in an environment, and to acquire, enrich, or at least reproduce its powers. No brick naturally occurs in a building. But likewise, the stone that the brick is made from, when it was still a stone, no stone naturally occurs in a mountain. No human being naturally belongs to an army or a religion, but likewise, no liver, no heart naturally belongs to the human body. This is to say, things are only the parts or the environment of a certain machine insofar as other entities, other machines, put them there and keep that coupling active. No matter how tightly two machines A and B are interwoven, an encounter with machine C can always sever their connections and carry one of them away to lands unknown. Moreover, that third entity may alter the very essence of A or B by drastically altering its powers. And this perpetual threat or promise, again, depending on the case, is what Deleuze and Guattari call a line of flight or a deterritorialization. Every brick may be loosened and turned into the weapon of an activist. Every stone may be dislodged and dragged away by an avalanche. Every soldier can desert the army. Every believer can lose their faith. And every organ in your body can fail. It's a very joyful metaphysics. So this metaphysics is not just a realism that affirms the existence of a mind-independent world, and it is not just a pluralism that says that ultimately a lot of different stuff exists. It is also a constructivism that does not just draw our attention to the irreducibility of things, but also to the relations of production and the connections with other entities that are required to establish that irreducibility, as well as the specific character of a machine in each case. So the metaphysics of machines shows us that reality is not simply and exhaustively determined top-down. Things understood as machines are always, in a fundamentally metaphysical sense, more than however a structure or institution or overarching project makes them appear, behave, or function. This is because things are not their manifestations, but rather their puissance, their powers, and a power can always be expressed in indefinitely many different ways from its current manifestations, right? If Claude and Nikki are forcing me today to say precisely these words and no others, then I still have the power to speak other sentences in English. But neither is reality determined bottom-up. Things understood as machines are not reducible to their parts, because your parts help generate and regenerate your powers, but such powers to act and be acted upon are emergent properties with regards to those parts. Instead, the metaphysics, and I approach the end here, the metaphysics of machines asks us to understand reality as being generated au milieu, as Deleuze will put it, in the middle, between things, among things. The price to pay here is that there can be no recourse to lofty Platonic heights or sturdy pre-Socratic depths where we can comfortably surveil reality from the outside. Everything happens from the middle. And that being said, I would like to end with a quote that has always impressed me and that seems to sum everything up. It is from the book Dialogues, which Deleuze co-authored with Claire Barnett. And it's from a text in which they recall David Hume's empiricism, but it applies equally well to Deleuze's own second metaphysics. So here comes the quote. Relations are external to their terms. Relation is neither internal to one of the terms, which would consequently be the subject, nor to two together. Moreover, a relation may change without the terms changing. And if one takes this exteriority of relations as a conducting wire or a line, one sees a very strange world unfold fragment by fragment, a harlequin's jacket or patchwork made up of solid parts and voids, blocks and ruptures, attractions and divisions, nuances and bluntnesses, conjunctions and separations, alternations and interweavings, additions which never reach a total, and subtractions whose remainder is never fixed. End of the quote. Thank you very much.